Good afternoon. I'm Stacey Young, president here at Montcalm Community College. I have the exceptional privilege of introducing our speaker today. It's important to me that MCC uses its collective voice to educate not only our students, but also our community on diversity and inclusion. In fact, the students of today demand that we work towards a more diverse and inclusive society. Education opens our minds and encourages us to think differently. It also creates an environment where we can safely discuss important matters. For these reasons, I'm exceptionally grateful that MCC can bring a speaker today that can tie history with today's environment. Dr. Lewis Moore is an associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University. He teaches classes in African American history, civil rights, sports history, and also U.S. history. His research and writing examines the interconnections between race and sports. He is the author of 2 recently published books. The first one, I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915, and also We Will Win the Day, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. He also has written for a number of online outlets, including the Shadow League, Vox, and African American Intellectual Society, and has appeared in news outlets such as NPR, MSNBC, and BBC Sports, talking about sports and race. Please join me today and welcome to all of you for listening to Dr. Moore. We're really looking forward to his speech today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate this. It's such an important time to have this conversation. What I want to do today as a historian is do 2 things. One, I want to give you the history, right? As a historian, I don't think you can understand what's going on today in 2020. Not only the police brutality that we see on our TV, but also the protests without understanding this long history of protests against police brutality. So I'm going to spend the first few minutes giving you an overview of 1865 to 1965. And then what I'll do is shift into a PowerPoint so we can talk policy and policing to make sure we understand how do you get a George Floyd, how do you get an Elijah McClain, how do you get a Breonna Taylor, right? And there's some very specific reasons about policies that happen in the United States. Okay, so first I want to start with this story map. Story map is a really cool tool that you can use in any setting. I use it here usually to teach in my classroom, or have students use a story map to learn and to do some active learning, and then I'll publish them publicly. So this map is actually published publicly. It's visible in Justice 1865 to 1965. Now, I chose 1865 for a very specific reason. 1865 is the year that the 13th Amendment was passed, and that amendment frees the slaves. It passes December 1865, and I want to show you this. I'll start here. This is from New Orleans, 1865, and it's a plea from Black Americans in New Orleans, and they say, "It is our duty to say so loud that our voice may reach the Capitol in Washington, that the police in this city are devoted entirely to the rebels, that they are willing to assist the latter to quench their thirst for Negro blood, and that they are not to be relied upon." I start this presentation here because at the moment of emancipation, Black Americans are letting folks know in DC, right? We need federal intervention to deal with the police, right? Because it's clear to them that freedom is not truly freedom unless you can deal with police brutality. Now, to be clear, at this point in 1865, you still don't have your civil rights, right? That's the 14th Amendment. That's going to come in 1868. You don't have voting rights. That's 1870. But from the beginning, there's a clear link that freedom is going to be peace from police brutality. So what I'm going to do for the next 20 plus slides is go over time. Now, I could do every year and show a moment of police brutality, but that would take forever. That's 100 slides. So I condense it down to 30 slides, and you'll see pleas against police brutality, right? And calls for help locally and both nationally. Here, Memphis, 1866, the same thing. You wind up having 46 Black people killed. They burned down multiple schools and homes, and it all starts between white police officers and black soldiers, right? And then other soldiers will step in. You have what you call the Memphis Riots. Again, these first two I showed you is a combination of the police and military power. Think about how when we watch these rebellions or riots, depending on what you want to call it, whether in Louisville or St. Paul and New York and Los Angeles, the combination of policing and military to push down black populations. 1886, this one should just really hit you in the gut. Pull out the quote from the black newspaper, 1886. The police as a body will commit more murders than any other class and go unpunished because they wear blue coats and brass buttons, unless something is done to check them. Again, this is not 2020. This is 1886. Calls from the black community say, look, there is no check on this power. If you pay attention to what's going on in the last couple of days, right? If you're following the case of Breonna Taylor in Louisville and you're following the backlash, a lot of that is to check that police power. 1897, the same place that George Floyd was murdered in 2020. You have pleas from the black community. These occurrences, which are becoming altogether too frequent, would not be tolerated an instant in any other civilized city on earth. Think about that. You have 123 years of having an opportunity to deal with this, to end this, and yet we still have these problems. Georgia, 1915. It's a black kid walking down the street and the police decides to shoot him in the back. 10-year-old boy just killed by the police. 1917, Houston, what we call the Houston riots, starts because police are abusing citizens in the city, and finally local armed military, black military in Houston step up, and this is indeed a riot. There's literally a shootout between black infantrymen and the police. Now, if you're interested in this and you're more into the pop culture side of this, a movie just came out in 2020 called The 24th. Obviously, after the 24th Infantry, it's okay, but it's what you're starting to see here with this Houston riot, or if we skip ahead to Tulsa in a bit, is that there's going to be more movies made about these types of things. And so 1920, Cleveland, you hear pleas from the black community. There has been a growing tendency upon the part of the police, both private and public, to kill members of the race sought for committing crimes and misdemeanors. Less respect for the lives of our people is being shown, and that is something that interests all in this community, right? So it's, again, a plea for help, but also a plea for everybody in Cleveland to do something about these murders. 1921, Tulsa. If you watch The Watchmen, you might have seen something about this, right? Nearly 300 black people were killed. The police were part of these riots. They actually took a plane from World War I and dropped bombs on the black community. Again, a horrific instance, but another instance where you see the police stepping in to punish the black community. 1922, New York. Residents in the immediate neighborhood of the station house declare that it is a common happening for them to be aroused and disturbed by sounds of severe beatings administered to prisoners at the state house. And it's alleged that these beatings are administered not only to male prisoners, but that women are handled in the same manner. 1924, Harlem. Cries of mercy, mercy. Oh my God, please stop. Please, please, please. Brought severe punishment to women. This is about women prisoners being abused. Again, I know this seems like a lot, but I just want you to get the sense of how long this has persisted. It's not a 2020 thing. It's not a 2019 thing. It's since emancipation. This man in Detroit put his hands up when he was fighting another man because the police told him to put his hands up. He tried to talk to the police officer. The officer hit him in the head. And when he put his hands on top of the head because he got hit in the mouth, he was shot and killed by the police. Here's pleas in St. Louis to get the Missouri governor to halt police brutality. Think about 2014. Mike Brown, right? Nearly, what is this, 80 years later, or 85 years later, the same thing, asking the governor of Missouri to stop police brutality. 2014, 1929. Miami, Florida. A witness saw two police officers beating a Negro girl with a knotted cowhide whip. They beat her, and without even permitting her to say a word in defense, shoved her homeward. New Orleans, blacks and whites protesting police brutality, asking local officials to stop this after an unarmed 17-year-old black kid was murdered. I like the strength in this, right? Both races protest police brutality. It's this notion that it's not just black folks doing it, but here in New Orleans, you have black and white. And that's where we're at today. Harlem, they're protesting illegal raids. Think about the no-knock in Louisville with Breonna Taylor. This is 1938. Now you're going to start to see a lot of cities step up, getting the government, trying to get the local government to end police brutality. 1939, you have a mass movement in Detroit to end police brutality. Washington, D.C., 2,000 people protested in the nation's capital to end police brutality. And they had chants like "Down with lynching" and "Stop police brutality." And there was another 10,000 people watching them, again, in the nation's capital. St. Louis, grand jury to study 9 cases of police brutality. I love this picture here. On the side, it's an editorial from a black newspaper. On the side, it talks about Jim Crow, it talks about ending police brutality, ending lynching. And for them, it's all wrapped up to one. 1947, New York is trying to curb police brutality. City acts to curb police brutality. So this is how long we've been at this. Cincinnati, the same thing. The city of Cincinnati is seeking police reforms. But yet here we are. And this is important here. 1947, I know I'm breezing by this quick. This is important here. This is to secure these rights. This is the first time the federal government is going to look at civil rights, right? So to back up, to make sure we're at the same page here, if we talk about our rights. So you have the 13th Amendment passed in 1865, 14th Amendment 1868, 15th Amendment 1870. But then you have by 1896 Jim Crow. And so by the turn of the century, most black folks can't vote in the South, right? And then you have separate but equal. And so the federal government's like, you come off World War II and you fight this war for democracy. What can we do? And so it's under the Truman administration where they're studying, like, what are we going to do to pass civil rights legislation? Now, we know from our history that Civil Rights Act doesn't get passed until 1964, voting rights not to 65, housing 1968. But this is the first time the federal government's like, we need to do these things, right? We can't be a full and complete America when we have a citizen, black citizens, right? Jim Crow, right? But part of what comes out of this is also acknowledgement that police brutality has to end and that you can't have full rights, right, without an end of police brutality. So I want you to hold on to this, because the federal government is admitting in 1947 that part of civil rights, right, is that freedom from police brutality. And this will continue on and on. Memphis, 2 policemen blind an ex-soldier. It's a number of cases, if you're interested in that. The other one's Isaac Woodard. NAACP in Detroit suing the police department. Pittsburgh, don't choke her. A young girl's choked by the police. Cleveland is ordering a probe to police brutality. Yet we still have something like Tamir Rice happen where a 12-year-old boy is killed within 2 seconds playing with a toy gun on a park. I love this political cartoon. It comes from the Michigan Citizen paper. And it's essentially our Michigan Chronicle. It's a black newspaper in Detroit. And it says protector of rights or obstacle to first-class citizens, right? And this is so important because this is how the black community tends to see the police, right? Are you a protector of our rights, or are you an obstacle to first-class citizenship? And I love it because the club has that blood on it. And this is how black Americans experience the police. 1960, you have a major protest in Philadelphia. Stop police brutality. 1961, another victim of police brutality. It goes on and on. One of the more important things I'll show you here, this is Martin Luther King from his I Have a Dream speech. We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of unspeakable horrors of police brutality. Think about this, how many times on MLK Day, or how many times when we see people protesting in the streets and people say, well, what about MLK? What about nonviolence? Isn't what King wanted. And then we come here and said, man, he wants to end the police brutality. And I'll end this here with this picture. And this is from Detroit, 1965, again, the Michigan Chronicle. And it should provoke images of George Floyd. I do this intentionally here. You have a police officer on a citizen's neck, right? And I want to come to 1965 because I think 1965 is so pivotal to understanding what's going on here. It's so pivotal to understanding the movement here. So let's start here. So I start in 1965. That's 100 years after 13th Amendment. And then 100 years after 13th Amendment, you have Watts riots. Watts riots is so essential to understanding what's going on today. So Watts riots happened 5 days. 5 days after the voting rights is passed. I always tell people this in my class. I tell people when I do this interview, especially now, because we hear a lot of vote, 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 vote. And now, obviously, you should vote. That's not the point. But the point is that folks in the West, Watts in Los Angeles, had the vote. But these barriers to inequality persist no matter if you had the vote or if Jim Crow's around. So 1964, you get the Civil Rights Act. 1965, you get the Voting Rights Act. And then what you have here is the Watts riots. And I like this picture here because it shows you, right? These two photos are from the LA Times. It kind of shows you what's happening, right? Los Angeles, looting, riots, death, daily discrimination. And then on the right, there's that political cartoon. Now our job is to find the root cause for unrest in this ghetto, predominantly Negro neighborhood, right? So what's the root cause? What's going on in Watts? Well, you have a predominantly white police force. I believe there's 200 officers, 195 of them are white. You have high poverty. You have low unemployment or high unemployment amongst not only the Black population, but the Black youth population. What we know when Black teens don't have jobs, right? They tend to get into trouble, right? Especially poor folks. And then on top of this, what you have that night that starts the riots is just a regular arrest of drunk driving. Some rumors spread that a Black woman's killed in the process, and 34 people died, millions of damage is done. But if anyone's paying attention, everybody knows that it's the policing. Between 1964 and 1967, you have more than 100 riots in America. The overwhelming majority are sparked by police brutality. So, what is the root cause of this? If you've been listening to the Black community, right? If you've been listening to the Black community, they'll tell you it's police brutality. So these are clips that I took from Black newspapers, right? Huge mass rally demanded to end police brutality. It's another part of police brutality. It's a Los Angeles police brutality. So Los Angeles has been telling you that there's a police brutality problem. But what the people see, what the media and the government see, is that there's a violence problem, especially amongst the riots. So I like using these political cartoons, right? Civil rights advances are burned. On the one hand, you have we shall overwhelm. And so the media goes to this. Think about this. If you turn on the news today to watch what's going on in Louisville, on the one hand, you have a police brutality protest, but on the other hand, you have people talking about the rioters, the looters, or whatever you have it. And so the moment your eyes go to the protest and perhaps maybe some fires and whatever's going on in the streets, you forget about the structural inequalities. Even though they've been telling you about policing being a problem, you go straight to the protest. 1966, the great James Baldwin. You can get this online. If you type in a report from an occupied territory, James Baldwin has this beautiful write-up about the 1964 riots in Harlem. And he says this. Now, what I've said about Harlem is true of Chicago, Washington, Boston, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. It's true of every northern city with a large Negro population. And the police are simply the hired enemies of the population. They are present to keep the Negro in his place, to protect white business interests. And they have no other function. They are, moreover, even in a country which makes the very grave error of equating ignorance with simplicity, quite stunningly ignorant. And since they know that they are hated, they are always afraid. One cannot possibly arrive at a more surefire formula for cruelty. This is why those pious calls to, quote, respect the law, always to be heard from the prominent citizens each time the ghetto explodes, are so obscene. The law is meant to be my servant and not my master. Still less my torturer and my murderer. To respect the law in the context in which the American Negro finds himself is simply to surrender his self-respect. You could take those words and you could drop them to today and they would read perfectly clear. What he goes through in this paper is saying every summer, you know, in the 60s, 64, 65, here in 66, even before that, he gets called to the White House, right? Because the White House at that time would bring black leaders in to say, what do we have to do? And he's saying, look, I'm telling the White House administration about poverty and policing. This is how you end this. And yet what we keep hearing is more and more policing. So again, the signs are there, right? The information is there. To stop these problems, we have to do these certain things, but it keeps getting ignored. So you get stuff like Detroit 1967, perhaps our largest riot in history, right? 43 people dead, millions and millions and millions of dollars in damage. And again, the community had been telling you it's policing, right? So the Detroit riots start a routine arrest of folks at an after-hours club, and it spreads to the city. But here I've placed a number of clips from newspapers that you see. Right, Detroit policeman charged with wanton killing a Negro. Again, protector of rights or obstacle to first-class citizenship. NAACP suing Detroit. This image of the officer on the person's neck. But what we see is the mob violence, is the end to civil rights. Again, I do this intentionally because I want you to understand what's going on in St. Paul, what's going on in Louisville within these last few months. They're the same things we see. One hand, there's a call to end police brutality, a long historical call to end police brutality. On the other hand, we just see mob violence. Now, what do you do about this? Here in the 1960s, this was the choice: programming or policing. And there's an opportunity. I want you to think about this because Tupac, I don't know if you guys have heard of Tupac, maybe you guys are young, but he says, and I'll have this quote later on the power slides, instead of a war on poverty, you got a war on drugs so the police can bother me. So we do have a war on poverty. LBJ starts a war on poverty in 1965. It will end in the 1980s. But this is just kind of like self-help programs, right? All right, so Job Corps, CAPS or community action programs, Head Start, food stamps, Medicaid, stuff we still have today, not so much the community action programs, we fund those differently. But the problem is, and the problem what people say is they don't create jobs, right? So what people wanted at this time was a domestic Marshall Plan. If you remember from your history, if you're not familiar with it, the Marshall Plan comes from World War II. And this is, and essentially we spent billions of dollars propping up Western Europe after World War II, so they don't go socialism, they don't go communism. And so what others at this time want, same thing. Let's get jobs to poor whites, poor blacks, poor Native Americans, poor Hispanics, right? Let's give them an opportunity. These self-help programs from the war on poverty, although they're helpful, they're ladders, right? They're not guaranteed jobs or guaranteed incomes, and so you're going to still have the problem, especially with automation, that's robots or technology taking over jobs, or some of these jobs moving out. The other part about it is Johnson didn't want to start these programs because in his mind, if you give jobs, it looks like you're helping out blacks during the civil rights movement, even though these are for everybody. And the third part is that they always lacked funding. I love these political cartoons I showed. There's two of them here, right? You have, obviously you have the Vietnam War that's going to last roughly until 73. right? So you had the Vietnam War, you had the war on crime, and you had the war on poverty. And you can see, if you're looking at those photos, you can see just the different funding. Even the war on crime at that time, hold on to this, at that time, doesn't have adequate funding for some folks. And of course, the war on poverty has literally nothing, right? He's wearing no shoes, he's got a bow and arrow, and yet we equipped, right? So we're spending about 30 billion to 1 when it comes to Vietnam versus war on poverty. And then you have this other program, right, where you have Uncle Sam, this poverty program, you have what looks to be a poor black person, and then you have the U.S. space and Vietnam War, they're getting fat on U.S. funds, right? And it says at the bottom, sorry, but you'll have to eat later. All right, so the thing is, I want you to hold on to this, because we had an opportunity in the 1960s to deal with poverty. We had an opportunity in the 1960s to deal with policing. In fact, 1963 on the GOP's platform, what they said, we got to end police brutality, right? This has got to be part of our platform. And instead, what we do is we go law and order. So Nixon in the 1960s starts talking about law and order. So the political cartoon on the left is, you can see the police officer from Chicago's from the black newspaper, Chicago Defender. What this city needs is respect for law and order. But of course, they had the officer with the Klan hat on. And this is just symbolizing to the readership that it's essentially for them the same. This is how you police us. And then on the right, you have law and order sweeping Black Americans' justice under the rug. And to explain law and order a little bit better, I go to Bayard Rustin. Bayard Rustin is a critical member of the civil rights movement. He is behind the scenes for the most part. If you don't know his life, he's black. He's gay though, and at that time in the 50s and 60s, they were worried that if he was out front, people would assume something else about the movement, and so he actually stood in the background. But he organizes many of those events, like the March on Washington, right? And he's the one who actually teaches King a lot about nonviolence, right? And just the theory behind it, right? So he's essential to this movement. In the 1968, he's looking at the platform of Nixon, and they're talking about law and order. And he says law and order is a pledge to keep the Negro in his place. And it's not the Negro who's the most urgent domestic problem. It is his needs. It is not the Negro who's the greatest threat to the police. It is he who is already the greatest victim of police brutality and repression. It is not the Negro who is the most violent towards American society. It is the society who is most violent towards him. Think about this. In 1968, this is how folks saw law and order. And we're still hearing calls for law and order. Law and order in 68 is a dog whistle about keeping Black folks in their place with policing, just as it is in 2020. So we get law and order, which means we get stop and frisk. So stop and frisk, we've heard a lot about it recently in the news. That's not a new thing. That's coming out in the 1960s. And when you have stop and frisk, it essentially allows the police to come up on you, and just even if they suspect that maybe you're doing criminals. And so what we know from studies is predominantly Black and brown folks who get pulled over all the time. Right, so it's a simple violation of your rights, but this is where we're at. And so what I'm suggesting is, instead of having programs, instead of dealing with policing, what happens is, and you saw those images when I said this is what people saw with rebellions or the riots, you get more policing. And this is going to continue to grow. Right, so you got programs versus policing in the 1980s. And again, Tupac, instead of a war on poverty, they got a war on drugs so the police can bother me. What does this mean in the 1980s? I put these cartoons purposely together, or one's a political cartoon, the other one's an image that I stole from Google, so don't tell Google. But you have here on the left-hand side, it's just this imagery of what we would know as Saigon, right, when the U.S. is pulling out of Vietnam. But at the bottom it says, U.S. declares victory of war on poverty and pulls out, right? So this is the 80s. We're done with these poverty programs, okay? And so you have this mass of people just still appealing for help from the federal government. But instead of that, you get mass policing. The picture on the right is what you call battle ram, essentially a tank that they use to ram down your house, right? Forget no knocks. They're coming in and they're just busting through your door if they suspect that you're a drug dealer, right? And many times they get the wrong door and they just pull back out. If you're interested in hip hop, kind of conscious hip hop. There's a song from the mid 1980s by a rapper named Toddy T. You can look it up on this thing called YouTube. It's Toddy T. It's called Battle Ram. It's got this kind of cool little break dancing beat. And it's just about the battle ram coming in, and he's warning everybody. It started in LA, but it's coming to cities like Detroit and St. Louis and Atlanta. And it's just how we're going to police. And so remember, Tupac says, instead of having a war on poverty, you have a war on drugs, so you can bother me, right? And you can see that there's a war on drugs. Now, these stats are taken from the new Jim Crow. The anti-drug budget is going to increase from 1984 from 8 million to 94 million, right? But they're going to reduce the treatment by 200 million on people who have problems. By 1986, there's $2 billion for anti-drug policing. Remember, I showed you that picture from the 1960s about we're spending too much money on the war versus war on crime versus war on poverty. By the mid 80s, it's the same, right? We're spending billions on policing. The 1994 crime bill, the notorious 1994 crime bill, but I'm pretty sure you're going to hear about within the next month, right? Because Joe Biden played a strategic part in that, right? A $30 billion bill that includes $16 billion in grants to build prisons. Also has a 3 strikes law. But when we're talking about building grants to prisons, we're funding private prisons. And the only way these make money is to put people in there. So we are creating these houses to house people. And in order to do that, you have to arrest people. And so this is when you're going to see more and more interaction between the police and the Black community. Again, you have an opportunity to stop this. I put this here because I teach sports history, but it rejected $50 million for midnight basketball. So midnight basketball is from the late 1980s, where essentially you have basketball and these inner cities played, right, to keep kids off the street. The police were there to kind of police community interaction. Great program, both sides of the aisle loved it. But within the 1994 crime bill, it gets slashed just because the way politics are, right? Again, but you have this opportunity for programs, you choose policing. And then you have the broken windows theories. This is exactly from their article in The Atlantic. You can look it up. I think you only get so many free Atlantic articles a month. Your library could probably find you a PDF if you use doc delivery. But essentially, broken windows comes from 2 professors who talk about the need to return policing back to the community, right? So this is the picture that they use. But the main idea is that if you take the cop off the street, right, the kind of block cop that knew the neighborhood, police the neighborhood, and let's say someone smashed a car window, more car windows would be smashed. Or there's somebody, as you can see here, laying down on the ground who's drunk, and now the police is not there, you'll have more of these problems. But what happens here is, while this is essentially an article to call just for the beat cop, the cop to walk around the beat, know the neighborhood, maybe more community policing, is that police departments will take this to go after people. And this is how you get something like an Eric Garner, right? So selling Lucy cigarettes on the block, right? So a Lucy cigarette is that solo cigarette from a cigarette box, and he was selling solos, and the police were harassing him, and they actually choke him to death, right? That's that I can't breathe. But you get more and more of these interactions with the police, or getting arrested for having food on the train, or whatever these kind of daily routines are, more and more stop and frisk, with this idea that to clean up the neighborhood, you have to police, right? But this originally was just that cop, right? That get that cop on the street, walking the block. What police departments did was throw more and more cops at it, right? So now your daily interaction is with the police for simple stuff that should be kind of let go. But this explains so much, right? This explains why you have somebody, Sandra Bland, pulled over for something simple, or Mike Brown getting harassed for something, simple here, right? And this gets us to this point where really since about 2012, we've been seeing protests. And so 2012 is Trayvon, 2014 is Mike Brown. And so you have Black Lives Matter campaigns, right? You have Hands Up, Don't Shoot. That's Mike Brown. You have Say Her Name. That could be anybody, like Rukia Boy, Sandra Bland, or Breonna Taylor. You have I Can't Breathe, Eric Gardner. And so really over the last 8 years of our lives, we've seen major protests about trying to end brutality, right? But in reality, we've been seeing them since 1865. And the reasons what I'm trying to suggest to you that we keep having these moments is because we've never dealt with the police. As a nation, we've never agreed that when it comes to Black freedom, when it comes to Black equality, that police brutality has to be there. It has to be part of that conversation. How do you deal with this, right? The hard part is that we have a history of America that's seen the Black man as, or Black people as criminals since 1865, right? It's the whole point of the convict lease system. So how do you deal with this? If you're not going to do programming, you're not going to do funding. And I don't know. Now, lately, we've seen several suggestions. We had the defund the police movement, abolish the police movement. And these are important to understand. So defund the police movement is essentially what it says. It doesn't take away all their budgets. Take away some of that budget and put it towards programming. Right? So remember we talked about the 1960s where you could have programming. Right? Instead of having a war on poverty, you have a war on drugs so the police can bother me. Shift some of those resources around. Do you need the police at the Boys and Girls Club? Do you need the police doing mental health checkups? Can we fund more mental health, right? More mental health programs? Can we hire more mental health specialists, right? So an Elijah McClain doesn't happen. Right? How do we deal with these interactions? So this is what the defund is. How do we shift some of these resources instead of giving the LAPD billions of dollars? Instead of giving the money to Chicago Police Department. Now the abolish is a little bit more radical. It's a little bit more radical in the sense that it's envisioning a society that doesn't necessarily need prison or policing because the money that you would spend on it, all of it could go to programs. And it's a belief that if you have this type of programming, then you won't have the violence that we see that people say, well, we need policing. Right? It's a very radical shift in how we see our society. All this funding towards creating jobs, creating opportunities, mental health check-ins, dealing with using this money for resources. But I want to end here. I know I'm running out of time. I know people have questions. I'm going to quote James Baldwin again from Occupied Territory, Breonna Taylor. And here he says, they are safe only in their houses or war until the city passed the no-knock, stop and frisk laws, which permit a policeman to enter one's home without knocking and to stop anyone on the streets at will at any hour and search him. This is 1966, James Baldwin, who essentially said that Black Americans, the only place they had to be free, the only place was in their homes. And here he is in 66 saying that went away when you had stop and frisk. That went away when you had no knock. Yet here we are in 2020, right? Living this live history moment, right? Where a no knock warrant has resulted in a death. And we see the streets of Louisville last night and today. And the question has to be, what are we going to do? Are we going to do programs or are we going to do policing? And I thank you for your time. I'm going to try to shift back to you guys. If you guys can IT take over for we do questions or I have to give up stuff?
No, you're good. The Facebook feed is running about a minute behind. So as soon as they get caught up, I'm sure questions will roll in. For anybody else that does get caught up, just go ahead and put your questions in, and Dr. Moore is here to take them. And it looks like we do have one question in. It's a longer question, so bear with me here. And it says, thank you for showing the pleas that have been documented over the years, stating that police brutality must end to gain full civil rights for everyone in the U.S. Are there any tangible changes that occur after these outcries were voiced over the centuries? And it's a two-part. And so the second part, actually, I'll let you handle the first part first.
You know, I think on a federal level, we can say no. Locally, there's always something, right? So what we see even today would be like, okay, well, we're gonna fund the police on implicit bias training, right? That's the best example we can have today, right? And so we have tons of funding going to implicit bias training, or we're going to start a new program, community police program. And so in the 60s, you'll see that. You'll see police at the park, and you'll see police at the Boys and Girls Club, right? But what people say is that just increases the interaction between police and the community, and a lot of people say in a bad way, right? And so maybe that police is cool with a 9-10-year-old kid, but when that kid's 16, that's when the problem starts. And I think the other thing that we see here is that it's difficult for the police too, because their job is to police. And so now we put them in a position where they're playing. And I think that's always tough. So those are some examples that you see where people try to deal with police brutality.
All right, and the second part to that is society often paints the historical North to be civil and sympathetic to Black Americans. Your intro made it clear that Black Americans' civil rights were under threat in both the northern and southern states in the U.S. Can you speak to why this idea persists, the notion that there are places that are safe havens for Black Americans with our country?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think what happens is that we often paint the South as the boogeyman, and look, for great reasons, but we do that also to ignore the North, right? Like so if we look, a lot, there's 1919, we call it the Red Summer. Chicago, there's 37 people killed in a riot. You have riots in Washington, D.C. In the 19-teens, you have over 50 bombings, right, in Chicago, when people simply try to move out of what we call the slum or the ghetto into the suburbs. They bomb their house. You're very close to, I'm assuming, to Detroit, where and there's a very famous case in 1925 with Ocean Sweet. There's a place marker on his house. A Black doctor moves to the suburbs, and they start tearing up his house, and he and his family shot back and actually killed somebody. He actually gets off, right? Kind of this kind of castle doctrine, or what we call now stand your ground. But this kind of stuff always occurs, and the only way I can explain why we ignore the North and why we act at the safe havens is just because the way we teach history, right? There's North and South, there's slavery, there's Jim Crow, and it's just allows us to be very simplistic in how we think, right? And however, if we flip this and do what we call hard history, is really be honest about what's going on at the North, we'll be a lot better off, right? As a nation, to say, whoa, like, these housing policies that we've had in the North in the 19-teens, 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s created a lot of problems, right? The policing that we had in the North at this time has really created a lot of problems. But instead, we do the simple thing, and that's we just point to slavery and Jim Crow.
All right, the next question is from Lisa, and that is, what is the key thing we need to impress to our children about the opportunity we have right now for progress?
I mean, it's so hard, but I would think that, look, it's this idea that justice, the arc of justice, the King says, will always, that arc, the moral arc will always bend to justice. Eventually, we'll get there, right? The hard part is you never know when, and we've been saying we're gonna get there, you just never know when. But I think if you're I have young kids, 12, 9, and 8, and the best thing you could do as a parent is just, teach them. It sounds so simplistic, but teach them to treat everybody equally, right? And I think this generation is starting to get that, right? There is more awareness about bullying. There's more awareness about differences in us, and I think this generation is gonna get it right. And so we just need to have, as older folks, patience for them, and just hope that they do get it right.
All right, Jessica asked, do you think the proposed changes under the Defund the Police movement would make enough of a shift to matter regarding social tension and conflict?
I think it. I think I think what people need, I'm a firm believer in programs, right, and opportunities. And look, if you're from this a neighborhood where there's not a lot to do, job wise, or you can't go to this your local Y, or you don't have good schools, or stuff there, then you're gonna struggle, and then you're gonna find another avenue. So I really do believe that programming will help. And then I think on the other hand, it will get us to envision, look, as soon as your budget's cut, so we all know this from colleges, right? When that budget gets cut, it forces you to rethink education, to rethink what you're doing. And I think a cut of the police budget will get them to rethink, right, how they police. And I think that's where we can get, right? On the one hand, programming, but on the other hand, it's like, man, when you lose money, you got to shift your thinking. And I think that will be so important.
All right, question from Jackson. Why do we distinctify people based on race when even people of the same race are different of ourselves? Am I in the right line of thinking for saying race doesn't matter, given that people are different regardless of race?
Right. So I think the most important thing, Jackson, is not to treat people as a monolith, right? That is to say, everybody is not the same. And so certainly every Black person is not the same. Every white person is not the same. And so you don't want to paint that person. Yeah. And I think, unfortunately, the negative that comes out of that is, a guy commits a crime, say a Black person commits a crime, and we tend to see that all Black folks are criminal, and then that creates a lot of problems, right? So you're right. You want to treat people individually, right? Now, how do we get there? Right, we have to be willing to open ourselves up as a nation to get there. And I think the problem is that we're dealing with years and years and years where we treat people as a monolith, as a nation. On the one hand, it's because it's convenient, right? And I think we are divided. So you're right? If we see people as individuals, we'll be a better society. The problem for so many people, though, is that we have these structural barriers that on the face say, well, this is not about race. But in reality, some of these barriers that we have in our society really tend to hurt people based on race, right? And so we have really two problems here, right? How do we treat people better, but also how do we look at some of these barriers that that really are going after races specifically.
All right, question from Anonymous. Dr. Moore, what would you say to people that downplay police brutality on Blacks by pointing out white people are also killed?
I would say that's still police brutality, and that's the thing I always say, right? Like, police brutality is police brutality. It just so happens that we hear it from, let's say, Black and Brown communities, and I think that if we say, yeah, white people are killed by police, then we should have that conversation, right? That's a very important conversation to have, to talk about policing in general. Now, what people will say that if we get it into police brutality for, let's say, the people who are seen at the lowest, right, by the police, then we could solve that problem for white folks. But you're right. Like, I don't think we really solve this problem without really acknowledging how bad in some places policing is. Now, and I think just in general, I know no one's asking this, but part of the problem is that, look, I like pop culture. I love the movie Bad Boys, all three of them. The third one's terrible. But if we watch the Martin Lawrence, Will Smith ones, right, there's tons of policing. Bad police brutality where Martin Lawrence and Will Smith, who are Black, are beating up people, right? And so at some point, it doesn't really necessarily have to do with race as much as it does this system of policing that we have. And I think to talk about white folks who are abused by police is healthy. I don't think it's healthy, though, when we only bring it up to silence others, right? And so we have to figure out how we include that in the conversation without trying to silence others.
All right, this question is from Maggie. As a smaller community than a larger city like Grand Rapids or even Chicago, What are ways we can help with Black Lives Matter in our own little towns?
Yeah, great question. I would think just as people say, you want to show up as an ally. You don't want to center yourself, right? But you want to show up as an ally, and figure out what groups. It's not just BLM, but right. It's just figure out what groups need your support, your resources, your time. And I think that's the best way to show up, and then educate folks around you too, because sometimes it's not just Maggie, right? It's Maggie needs to talk to her friends and to her families, right? To make sure that we have a better community.
Next question is from Ty. Do you think the riots and pleas for change will continue as they have through history if nothing is done federally? Or do you think that they will increase now that people have more access to information about things happening around the world?
Yeah, I think these next few months are going to be very tough. This is going to be very, very, very tough because there's not going to be a call to federally to stop what's going on. There's going to be calls to stop the protesting, and I think it's just going to get violent. And we've seen this in Wisconsin when a 17-year-old kid comes with what I think is AK-47. And winds up killing people. It's just going to be problematic if you don't have proper leadership, right? So hopefully there's going to be proper leadership to calm folks down. But look, this is not meant to be. This is not anti-Trump. It's not anti-Biden. Even though Ferguson happens over Obama, and it doesn't really have a calming influence, right? The best way to deal with this is really having the federal government to take the time to study what's going on and really use its power of its purse and funding to try to slow things down.
All right, excellent questions. We have one more on the queue. Actually, one just rolled in. Is there a way, this from an anonymous, is there any way to get a copy of your slides or video if it's copyright?
So the story map is public. It's public. I can send a link here in a second to IT, but that is public. As far as the presentation, I don't know how to make that. You could just send me an email, at morelou@gvsu.edu. If you like, and I can share it with you. But yeah, but the story map is public. As I got others public somewhere. I think at Prof. Lou Moore, I have others public. I haven't put this one on, but I will. ProfLouMoore.com.
Yeah, I'll add to that as well. This presentation is being recorded, so we'll be uploading it on our end and sharing it out. And also, it's on Facebook Live as well, and so that should be available for later consumption also. Another question rolled in. My daughter believes peaceful protests don't work. Riots get people heard. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Okay. So it depends what we're talking about in general, right? So peaceful protests will help integrate buses like we saw in Montgomery, right? But neither rioting or peaceful protests has ended this policing platform. But to come to this idea that riots get people heard, this is MLK learned this in 1965. He goes to Watts and he was like, just like, what's going on here? And he saw kids like happy and cheering, and he's like, why? How could you cheer? Look at your neighborhood's destroyed. And he says, but we made them listen. Right? The kid said we made them listen, and that's that point. Right now, people are listening, right? And so, look, property can be rebuilt. I'm not saying go out there and destroy property, but folks would say, property can get rebuilt. It's question whether it did get rebuilt in '67 after Detroit. Many folks left there, but in general, this stuff can be rebuilt and changed. But we need to have these hard conversations, right? It's the reason why I started this map in 1865. It's been since the beginning, right, of emancipation, and yet you're still having these pleas. And so some people, when they get desperate, they believe this is the only method to get change. right? I guess the other method would be to make sure you have people on your local city council or boards or whatever you have to change laws locally, right, to deal with the funding locally. But still, people think like, man, I just can't continue to go on, so let me lash out now. And part of the reaction is either going to be more policing. We're going to send in a National Guard, or maybe you'll have a police chief, like say in Grand Rapids, who will say, okay, what's going on? Can we get a seat at the table? So yeah, that's where we're at here. It's just hard to tell, right? It's just really hard to tell. But you always wish that, in the end, that things were peaceful. But I think we should understand that sometimes they do get violent, and we just hope that nobody gets hurt.
All right, Dr. Moore, it doesn't look like we have any questions in the queue. Maybe a couple seconds here in case any more roll in. These have been awesome questions.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, since it is 1 o'clock, actually a little bit after, we'll go ahead and wrap it up now since there are no more questions. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Moore. Thank you for all in attendance for tuning in as well. Like I said, the recordings will be available. We'll be sending those out via our communication channels. But once again, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Moore. Safe travels. I think you said you're out in California right now, so we wish you a safe ride back, and have a great rest of your day.
All right, thank you.